Thanks so much, Mark, for that overly kind introduction. And it's great to see all of you here tonight. I'm glad this wasn't last night. I was in Uptown yesterday during the deluge. So it's a great pleasure to be here tonight to talk about the world's second oldest profession. I want to say that before we start, we'll be talking about diplomacy tonight. There is a distinction in the field between diplomacy and foreign policy. They're not exactly the same thing. And I want to offer those definitions now so that it's clear where we're going here. Diplomacy is the profession, the activity or the skill of managing international relations, typically by a country's representative abroad. So it really is the art and practice of conducting negotiations, managing the communications. You're the messenger if you're a diplomat. Foreign policy is a government's strategy or policy in dealing with other nations to achieve national objectives. So in a way, the content is foreign policy. The implementation is diplomacy. And one of the most important skills in this implementation is communication. Clear communication. Foreign service officers are taught, and I teach my students at the U as well, to communicate clearly, both written and oral. There are enough differences with other cultures, other nations. There's already a difficult communication in the structure of things, and you have to put a priority on that, which is why any country's diplomacy that gets off track with communication with other nations will tend to have difficulties. And of course, we're seeing some of that today. I'll go into that a little, especially during the questions. Mary and I will be up here discussing, but also taking your questions. She's a marvelous resource on the foreign policy, the diplomacy as well. I'm looking forward to being up here with her. So I'll be talking about the practice of diplomacy. And there are some, to my mind, very high stakes involved. We're moving into a much more multipolar world, as we all know, where communication and managing relations will be key. We're moving into a whole new era of technology, which is already impacting the way we get our news, public opinion, but also communications among governments. And that's one area that's very important, I think, for what we'll be talking about tonight. The other, though, is governance. It's not just the State Department today that is under assault. This is happening all through Washington, in the entire governmental structure of our country. And I want to spend some time talking about that, about the structure of governance, the tradition of governance in our country, with the State Department as an example. Because with other powers emerging, with very different approaches to governance, and of course I'm thinking of China, which is coming forward with a whole different model for the way to run a polity. This is not something we can take lightly anymore, in my view. The United States will always have a foreign policy, will always have a diplomacy. The question is, will it always have a profession of diplomacy? Will it always have a professional diplomatic corps? And that is an open question today. Now, State Department, I'm just going to give you a couple of visuals about what we're dealing with here. There's the Washington Mall, and just at the far end, past the Washington Monument on the right, that white blob is the State Department. It used to be closer to the White House in the old days. Now it's down in a swamp down there in Foggy Bottom. This is it, the Truman Building. From externals, it seems to be doing pretty well. I encourage people to visit the State Department. It really is an interesting thing, especially up on the 8th floor of this building. That's the view from the balcony there. The diplomatic rooms of the State Department are arguably the grandest collection of art from the late 1700s to about 1825. This is the dining room where state dinners are held. This is one of the reception rooms. You can visit this by appointment. You have to sign up in advance. They only take small groups in, but it's one of the great museums of Washington, D.C., and is not visited enough. And actually, it's interesting. This is where we conduct our diplomacy. This is where the meetings take place with the Secretary of State and senior staff. There's the desk on which Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. There are many, many, many more iconic, truly iconic artifacts in this 8th floor diplomatic space. The State Department has just opened up a new diplomacy center, which can also be visited. The idea that we need to know more about the history of our diplomacy, it's a brand new installation. And once again, something that can be visited in Washington at the State Department. And in the State Department, on the ground floor, there are a number of large auditoriums. This is the Dean Acheson Auditorium. A lot of meetings are held. And along the walls outside are photos sort of depicting the history of U.S. diplomacy. I just want to show you a few. I'm kind of taking you on a tour inside the State Department here. I was there in May for the annual Foreign Affairs Day meeting, where alums like myself go back. You can see photos of Dean Acheson, Harry Truman. This was a key period because it is when women really began to emerge in the Foreign Service. First woman entered in 1922. Rogers Act, I'll be discussing, set up the modern Foreign Service. And in 1949, the first female ambassador was appointed. And she is noted and recognized right there in the State Department. As you can see, it's Eugenie Moore Anderson, who was a DFL politician at the time. She became ambassador to Denmark. Once again, the very first female U.S. ambassador, and she was from Minnesota. You can see here how she is depicted in the halls of the State Department today. And of course, we see John Foster Dulles, who really was key in the way the Cold War developed, Henry Kissinger. All these luminaries are along the walls there, and of course then Madeleine Albright, the first female ambassador, Secretary of State, and not the last. We've had 3 in rapid succession. So the logjam is broken. State Department used to be called, maybe still should be called, Male, Pale, and Yale. But today 35% of entering classes are female, and at the mid-level, I think it's achieving almost that level of 35%, which is a big change compared even to when I came in. But in some ways, the building is burning. I say that because Burns seems to be the name now of the people analyzing the State Department. Nicholas Burns, of course, wrote the Great Decisions article. He's at the Harvard Kennedy School now. I think very much wants to come back in at some point. I thought his article in the Great Decisions was good. It didn't take any risks, but it was good. It laid out the problems facing state, of which there really are a lot. It's been 230 years since the State Department was founded, 95 years since it became a real career with the Rogers Act. It's being decimated right now. 1/5 of all personnel are eligible for retirement now. 1/3 can retire in 5 years, 1/2 in 10 years, 50%, and the intake is nowhere near able to cover that. I recommend this book very highly by Bill Burns, William Burns, who until recently was the Deputy Secretary of State. He's worked in many, many administrations. He gives a very balanced account of U.S. foreign policy in recent decades and what's happening with the State Department. And he points out that the travails of the State Department did not just begin with Donald Trump. This has been going on now for decades. As he points out, from 1985 to 2000, in that 15-year period, which largely overlaps with the Clinton administration, the U.S. government foreign affairs budget was slashed by 50%. The real cuts, the real decimation took place because we felt we had a peace dividend. And this, obviously, we're still living with the consequences of that period and the victory of the Cold War. What's happening today is coming on top of what had already been a very serious jolt. And of course, after 2000, as Bill Burns points out, U.S. diplomats were pressed into social engineering and nation building in Afghanistan, and Iraq, of course. A tremendous distortion of the service. The British had a colonial service in the 19th century, as Burns pointed out, but they had that on top of their Foreign Office. They didn't take their colonial service out of the Foreign Office, which is a huge difference. And I'll be talking more about the details of what followed. So, and with Donald Trump now coming in, I just saw a statistic of high-level appointments at the State Department, and this is Assistant Secretary level and above. Over 90% are political appointees. 90%. The career diplomats are few and far between today at the senior levels of the Foreign Service. We had Ambassador Barbara Bodine in town last year. She's the head of the Institute for Diplomacy at Georgetown University. And she told our group, what we face now is an effort not only to diminish the role of diplomacy and the work of diplomats, but to dismantle the structure of the professional corps. And this is really, I think, these are the stakes. Our country, really ever since the 1980s, has seen government as the problem. There's been a tremendous erosion in the civil service and governance, not just at state, and it's happening on steroids right now with a very uncertain prognosis. Now, there are roots to what's happening right now that go way back in our history. In fact, what's happening right now, and maybe in some ways, is the default mode, for better or worse. Thomas Jefferson was, of course, our first Secretary of State. And he and Franklin and others spent 2 years negotiating the end of our Revolutionary War to get the Treaty of Paris, early example of diplomacy. But in fact, two factors really restricted the development of a diplomatic service in the United States all through the 19th century. The first was our wonderfully beneficial but problematic splendid isolation. Our geographical situation is unparalleled in the world. We have weak neighbors, we have oceans on both sides. This creates a kind of moral hazard, if you will, to this day in our foreign policy. And the idea was that we didn't really need one. Both of our key early presidents, the word entangling is very key in our early history. We didn't want any entanglements. Diplomacy was a form of entanglement for early America. And of course, exactly the same words were used by Thomas Jefferson. So this led to, as I say, a very halting development of any kind of diplomacy in the U.S. The second factor, apart from this geographical splendid isolation and this moral hazard that we still have today, was the determined effort by our founding fathers to make sure that no branch of government could ever become dominant. And it led to, as we all know, to the separation of powers. And you can see here the key differences are that our legislature ratifies treaties, it can declare war, it has to rubber stamp ambassadorial appointments, and this takes some of the responsibilities out of the hands of the executive. It's very interesting to my mind. I think this is an issue for our system of government. I say a lot of what we're talking about today are really systemic issues facing our country, as I say, even today. The existence of this kind of separation of powers in a presidential system, where the government does not fall when a legislative majority opposes policies of the executive. The president's in for 4 years unless he gets impeached, which never happens. So if this division persists, you have a permanent threat of unresolved struggle and even gridlock on foreign policy that's built in to our system. This gentleman, Mr. Corwin, who was the head of the American Political Science Association back in the day, is oft quoted as saying that this is an invitation to struggle for the privilege of determining U.S. foreign policy. There's an invitation to struggle that's built into our system. So In the 19th century, the official history of the Foreign Service, which came out in 1961, describes the entire 19th century of our diplomacy as follows. Haphazard organization, uncertainty of tenure, inadequate compensation, absence of any logical system of recruitment and promotion tended through most of the 19th century to restrict the diplomatic service to a small group of the relatively wealthy, and to make the consular service the victim of political spoilsmen. We forget how thoroughly corrupt our country was up into the early 19th century. It was called the spoils system. And pretty much all the jobs at every level would go to connected people to the administration. One example at State, Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was a roommate of Franklin Pierce, became our consul in Liverpool, which was the most remunerative post of all. A lot of people were leaving for the New World from there, for America, and the consular officers could keep all of the money that they made for their services. Meanwhile, as the consular service expanded, the number of diplomats was minimal, and the Congress constantly tried to reduce the number of missions abroad. In 1832, they tried to reduce the number of missions to 3, 1844 from 9 to 6. The first U.S. ambassador ever was in 1893, over 100 years after our founding, because it was deemed too European to have ambassadors. So we had ministers all around the world, always at the bottom of the protocol list in every capital where they were, and there weren't that many. So this was really, as I say, we were developing our continent. We were not really focused on diplomacy. I find it amazing that just 2 individuals were the State Department for nearly 100 years. They were basically it. This gentleman, William Hunter, for 57 years, from 1829 to 1886, was the senior clerk at State. He basically was the continuity. He did everything. And he was then replaced, actually slightly overlapped, but replaced by this gentleman, Alvy Augustus A.D., who's a legend. These are photos from the State Department, that row I showed you of the history of the State Department, who served until 1924 for 46 years. This is it. If you want to study U.S. diplomacy, basically these are the 2 guys. And A.D. is described as a walking encyclopedia of diplomatic history, practice, protocol, communication, and style. He was a shy bachelor, just over 5 feet tall, who had a falsetto voice and a gathering deafness that necessitated ever-enlarging ear trumpets. That was it. That was our Foreign Service back in the day. And here he is, a guy on the right there. Now, with World War I, of course, in 1883, the U.S. passed the Civil Service Act, which began to end the spoils system throughout the U.S. government, except in positions by executive appointment, which means the State Department continued until 1924 to be basically a lot of political appointees. In 1901, State had a total of 82 employees at home, 35 diplomats abroad, total. In the meantime, the consular service, which is part of the spoils system, had ballooned to 323 posts with over 1,000 people, all of them there because of patronage. So finally, in 1924, after World War I, as the U.S. role in the world expanded, the Rogers Act was passed, which regularized the service. Here's Wilson at World War I. This gentleman, Wilbur J. Carr, was one of the architects of it, the 3rd great figure in U.S. diplomatic history, who helped the implementation. It was no longer the spoils system. You had to pass an exam to get in, a written and oral exam, just as it is today. They looked at the Chinese examination system, thought that was a pretty clean system, and brought it into our State Department. It's a separate examination which students today prepare for, just as they did after 1925. 24. A new generation came in, people like George Kennan, a kid from Wisconsin. It's no longer a connected Civil War general or a financier from Wall Street or a famous writer. It's regular people who pass the exam. And this probably is the beginning of a better era for the State Department. By 1937, half of U.S. ambassadors were career Foreign Service. We've gone way back since then. It's about a third now, our career, and with President Trump, it's about half only. So this was a high watermark. George Kennan said something prescient, though, early in his career. He said, the Foreign Service officer is taught and encouraged to believe that he is serving the national interest, the interest, that is, of the country as a whole in its external relations. He finds himself working, however, for people to whom this is not the main concern. Their main concern is domestic politics. It would be not so bad, perhaps, if this incongruity could be admitted, but it is the very essence of the exercise that it must never be. And it's true, domestic politics really do still, as in many countries, but especially in our own, drive things. Now, I just want to pause here. There's a very interesting take on all this that I've just described. By the way, here's the pale in Yale class of 1950. As you can see, it is very pale. Probably about half those guys are from Yale or Harvard. I don't know. 27 members. Just in contrast, here's one of the most recent Foreign Service classes coming in today. And you can see much more diverse. So it is not all negative. There have been some real advances made in our diplomacy. This, by the way, is Pompeo. This is the first class to come in after a long hiatus of intake during Tillerson. So this was a happy group. But the observation I want to make is based on a book that's come out, two books over the past few years by Francis Fukuyama. He wrote The End of History. He's been writing ever since. He spent a lot of time looking at the origins of political order, democracy, and two huge tomes. This is the second one, Political Order and Political Decay. And here is his fundamental thesis, and also the way it applies to us. He says, those countries that created strong bureaucracies while they were still authoritarian, like Prussia, Japan, you could say France as well. The French bureaucracy comes out of the period of the monarchies. That those countries that already had strong bureaucracies before they became democratic created enduring autonomous institutions that survived subsequent openings under a democratic constitution. On the other hand, countries that democratized before a strong state was in place, such as the US, Greece, Italy, created clientelistic systems that had to be reformed. That's the spoils system of the 19th century. We did not have a state. We did not have a state structure. We had a democracy, we had an idea, we had an aspiration, but we did not have the wherewithal of an actual state. Now, as far as Fukuyama is concerned, the U.S. began to succeed in this in the 1920s with things like the Rogers Act. But nonetheless, the U.S. had developed a party-led patronage system beginning in the 1820s in which political appointees dominated the government at the federal, state, and local levels. In his view, the American phenomenon is more accurately labeled clientelism rather than patronage because it involves the mass distribution of individual benefits by politicians to supporters. In Fukuyama's view, we succeeded in the second and third decades of the 20th century in reforming the system and creating a modern civil service. He believes today that we are tumbling back. We are going back to in his view, almost a pre-modern state, in which, and some of what I'll describe, the figures I'll describe, I think, bear up some of this. And it's in this context that the existence of a professional foreign service is something that has to be looked at very carefully. Now, with World War II, obviously the U.S. role increased even more. The 1946 Foreign Service Act further solidified the State Department. In the context of the Cold War, the State Department got fairly steady funding, not extravagant, but steady funding, because the Cold War sort of focused everyone's mind. There were three developments, however, after World War II that had a big impact on our diplomacy and still do today. Number one, other actors arose. The National Security Council, which was founded after World War II. It took over the building that used to be the State Department. This is the Eisenhower building, the old executive office building, right next to the White House. State was moved down to the swamp in Foggy Bottom, and the National Security Council became a key competitor for the ear of the president. They are there right next to the West Wing Situation Room. This is the Situation Room where the key decisions are made on foreign affairs. And in recent years, the National Security Council has ballooned to hundreds of employees, way beyond what it was, for example, when Henry Kissinger was the National Security Advisor. And there are many calls now for reining in the National Security Council and balancing it out with the State Department. Other actors, of course, after World War II, almost every agency developed their own foreign component. At posts right now, according to the Congressional Research Service, there are 30 agencies at U.S. embassies, 30, that are there with the State Department, everything from the FBI to agriculture, military attaches, of course. Very far-flung, very unclear. The second development was the assertion of Congress and the development of lobbies. Robert Murphy, his book Diplomat Among Warriors is a classic from the 1950s, describes how even in the early 1950s he saw embassies in Washington beginning to go around the State Department and go directly to key congressmen, key committee heads to do the business of their country there. By the way, that's the way Canada does it. They're structured that way, to work around the executive branch at the local level and in Congress. And other countries do this as well. In the aftermath of, two happy guys, in the aftermath of the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal, Congress in the early 1970s took on more responsibilities for foreign policy. They upped the staff of all the committees. They created new committees to get more involved in foreign affairs. Tip O'Neill, there on the right, who was the Speaker of the House, once said that whenever he met a junior congressman whose name he didn't know, he would simply say, "Well, hello, Mr. Chairman, how are you?" That's how many committees there were. And it's ironic that the Congress took on all this new staff, many of whom are equal to the State Department staff in their knowledge, but less and less actually asserted itself on policy. For example, on declaring war, as we all know from the Iraq period. So Congress was a big part of this too. And then the third factor after new players, after Congress strengthening itself, was the advent of terrorism and what this has done to our foreign affairs structure. The Beirut bombing in the early 1980s, this is the Marine barracks, was a tremendous embarrassment to the U.S. Congress, a bit like Benghazi, right? They hadn't appropriated enough money to defend. And so the reaction was massive. The Congress mandated the creation of a whole new division at the State Department, Department of State Security, which in the ensuing years has mushroomed to nearly the size of the Foreign Service itself. They have their own building, and at post they are determined to make sure that no terrorist attacks occur. Thankfully they are. But they would like, if possible, to have all diplomats stay inside the building, as opposed to going out. You know, they often say that really diplomacy takes place in that last 5 feet, right? It's a very human enterprise. And if diplomats are afraid to or are restricted from even leaving their embassies, there's a problem. And there's a communication problem as well. Benghazi only added to that. You know, since Benghazi, everyone has focused Congress. Apparently, Rex Tillerson, at the beginning of every staff meeting, would say, "Is everyone safe?" Literally. And Mike Pompeo is also taking a very a very cautious approach in places like Sri Lanka. Bill and Charlotte Daveney were out in Sri Lanka when these attacks took place, and there was a quick evacuation of personnel from Colombo. Whether that was necessary or not, it's hard to say, but it shows the caution with which now everyone is approaching security. And if diplomacy is communication, we are communicating a very different persona to the world, partly because of this. Back really up into the 70s, the U.S. had cultural centers in most capitals that were accessible to the general public. Many, many young people in countries around the world got their first introduction to English, to programs, walking into, this in Germany is the America House. The America House, which was right down by the Bahnhof Zoo in downtown Berlin, very popular place. It became the target of terrorist attacks during the Baader-Meinhof period and closed. There was something similar in Paris, right at the Place Odeon, right across from the theater, where anybody could go in. And of course those days are over. Embassies are being relocated. This is the American Embassy in Oslo, right downtown. You can see it's already being fortified. It has since moved outside of town into a rural area, quite far out of town, well protected, but out of sight. Same thing recently with London. Here's the U.S. Embassy to the U.K. on Grosvenor Square, a very popular place always right in Mayfair. This is the new American Embassy, way down the river, and with a moat even. I guess I don't know what Department of State security person envisaged that, but it has a moat, and so much harder to attack. We have to have a periphery around our installations now. So this third factor of protecting our personnel it has had a big impact on our foreign policy. All this is, before what we've been talking about now. So the fall of the Berlin Wall, it ushered in, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, a whole new phase, the idea of a peace dividend that should be cashed in. And this was the basic idea of the Clinton administration. In 1992 to 94, they came up with the idea of reinventing government. Now, they were picking up on the Reagan approach to government, increasingly the threat from Congress, from Newt Gingrich. As in many cases, Clinton was taking steps toward the center, toward the other side, and how the entrepreneurial spirit is transforming the public sector. Al Gore was the architect, the driver of this. Here they are hauling government documents to the White House. I guess it's like burning of the books, except it's burning of the documents. As I say, this was the period in which foreign affairs funding was cut by 50%. The idea was we'd won the Cold War. Well, of course, history isn't always that simple, but when other crises arose, our diplomacy, our State Department was behind the 8 ball already. With 9/11, as Bill Burns pointed out, new tasks came to our State Department. And Colin Powell was the first to take them on. He tried to protect the State Department, but even then, state personnel were being taken away to staff provincial reconstruction teams, PRTs, with the U.S. military as junior partners to the U.S. military all around Afghanistan and Iraq. There was something called the Iraq tax, where positions would be taken out of U.S. embassies and sent over to Iraq. Not extra spending, but taken out of the hide, such that by the time George W. Bush left office, there were 1,400 unoccupied positions around the world in our embassies. They'd all been taken away over to Afghanistan and Iraq. And of course, with George W. Bush and Condi Rice, a whole new idea of transformational diplomacy came up, which further added to the strains. As Condi Rice stated, America needs a diplomacy that not only reports about the world but seeks to change the world itself. The role of a diplomat now is to be transformational rather than the traditional role of a diplomat. So the whole concept of the profession was really, I would say, under assault really since the end of the Cold War. Really since the end of the Cold War. And the U.S. diplomatic establishment had found itself whipsawed, first by the deep budgetary cuts in the 90s, then by the new tasks that had risen in the aftermath of 9/11. So the president of the American Foreign Service Association, on the right there, that's J. Anthony Holmes, a Foreign Service officer, wrote the following in Foreign Affairs in the midst of all this. He said, if the U.S. wants an expeditionary foreign service that can perform both traditional diplomatic functions and the type of nation-building tasks undertaken by the British Colonial Service, it will have to pay for it. He pointed out that there was a 21% vacancy rate abroad, and that this was, in a sense, hobbling our diplomacy. Now, when President Obama and Hillary Clinton came in, they recognized the problem. Studies were calling for a doubling of the Foreign Service, or at least a 50% increase at a minimum to make up for this. And they tried in the first 2 years to increase the Foreign Service. A lot of my students came in the first 2 years of Obama. They let in 950 one year, 900 the next. The goal was to increase by 25% in the first term. The 2010 midterm elections put a stop to that because you went into the sequester. And since 2010, there's been a net attrition in the Foreign Service such that it's down below where it was when Obama came in. It's ironic that the two really strongest supporters of the State Department of professional diplomacy have been military people. There's Jim Mattis, till recently Secretary of Defense, and Robert Gates. Robert Gates famously has said, look, there are more members of marching bands in DOD than in the entire State Department. We have more people in marching bands than they have in their entire bureau. And Jim Mattis has said famously, if you don't fully fund the State Department, I'll have to buy more ammunition. A lot of generals, ex-military people have signed petitions and things going to bat for state, which is, I think that they see that they're having to do things that, that ordinarily diplomats should do. Now we come to the present. The two people in the back are really the main part of this picture. But anyway, now the State Department today makes up under 1% of the federal budget. We have 277 posts overseas in 170 countries. Now, funding for the State Department has actually decreased over the past 4 fiscal years. The number one funded agency, of course, is Defense, which takes 36% of the federal budget. Veterans Affairs, 18%. Homeland Security, 9%. The only thing that's below the State Department is education. Tragically. State Department is about 1%, education under 1%. There are 1,880,000 federal employees. 23,000 of them are in the State Department. But the actual number of people working for state is 75,000 because 66% are local staff hired in the countries, nationals of that country, who really are the backbone in many cases of our representation abroad. That's 66% of our payroll. 13% is civil service, which basically is in Washington doing jobs there. 10% foreign service, 8% foreign service specialists, primarily the DS, Department of State Security, and 3% family members. One of the most unpopular things that Tillerson did when he came in was to ban the employment of family members at post. This was toxic for the Foreign Service. A lot of embassies depended on these dependents, and families of the Foreign Service people depended on having them work. So, and this was one of a number of Tillerson reforms to redesign the State Department. The underlying logic to what he did, in my view, and as you would expect from somebody coming out of business, was to create a more flexible workforce. In other words, do more outsourcing do more temporary appointments, the opposite of what you'd need for a professional foreign service, a professional diplomacy. He was assisted by Margaret Petterlin, who was not popular at State. I think that is an understatement. She was sort of the person. Tillerson was kind of off all the time. He really didn't do well with people. He didn't seem to like to be around people. Didn't want the press traveling with him. So he left things to his staff, which were quite draconian in the way they approached the State Department. So morale sank to ever lower levels. During this period, 60% of career ambassadors left. This is a lot of expertise going out the door. Career ministers went from 13 to 19, cut almost in half. So people are not coming back. Minister counselors from 431 to 359 and still falling. The number of entering Foreign Service officers in 2016, 366, 2017, under 100 and going down from there. Word got out. The year before Tillerson came in, 22,000 young Americans, some of them my students, and I'm sure Mary's students, took the Foreign Service exam. 22,000. Last year, 8,000. That's how much this has come to be seen as a problematic situation. Now, ironically, in the 19th century, the Congress was always trying to cut the State Department, eliminate it if possible. Well, in the last two budget cycles, it's been the Senate that has stood up to Trump and has prevented the deepest cuts. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee labeled the cuts, which were 30% in the first Tillerson budget, labeled them a doctrine of retreat of the U.S. in the world. And it said the state must support staffing at levels not less than September 30th, 2016. So thank goodness, the military as an advocate and the Congress actually have stepped in to prevent the worst. But morale is at a low level. As I mentioned, Mike Pompeo, in contrast to what was happening under Tillerson, was welcomed tremendously by the State Department when he came in April. It was right about the time of the Foreign Service Day. Bill Dabney and I were there and heard Pompeo speak, talking about the importance of morale, that he was going to allow staff to work. In fact, he made his wife the head of family services at the State Department, very astute move, and he unblocked the promotions and the intake of the Foreign Service. So the Pompeo era has been better that way. However, in one way, it has not been better. As the head of the American Foreign Service Association, Barbara Stevenson, said in May, there is underway at State a, quote, really brutal assault on women and minorities. In other words, numbers are up, but within those numbers, there's clearly a male and pale orientation going on. And in some ways even worse, there is a blacklisting going on. Theoretically, diplomats under the Hatch Act of 1939, amended in 1993, are not supposed to be involved in politics. As of 1993, at least not on the job. Bill Clinton eased it up a bit. So theoretically, you're supposed to serve any, I'm going to get scanned here. You're supposed to be able to serve any, I wonder if they're scanning those two or what's going on. Anyway, you're supposed to be able to serve any Secretary of State. Now, when an administration comes in, they do remove the political appointees. They're considered to be biased. And so political ambassadors, people at State, are taken out. By the way, of senior level positions at State, and that's going lower than the Assistant Secretary, in 1980, 2/3 were career. Now, 2/3 are political. Once again, it's the undermining of a professional service. But what's happened now is that career officers who worked too closely with the Obama administration are being blacklisted. And a good number of them are women who are being removed from posts And so this is a different kind of morale problem at state, even though the numbers are back up. Just 1 second here. That scan obviously did something. There we go. Now, the presence of this gentleman is another factor. It looks as if Pompeo has more cred with the president than Tillerson did, especially at the end. But he's having to deal with John Bolton and with Jared Kushner. So these three are really the key. Kushner's role is very hard to determine. He's very obviously influential in the Middle East, but not only. So the question is, as I say, whither the State Department in this situation? Here you can see the projections, State Department budget outlays. This is all under 1%, by the way, of spending, as I said. So we're going down to the levels even below the Education Department here, potentially. So maybe coming to save the day, maybe, it was Jim Mattis who rolled out in 2017 our new national security strategy. We've discussed that before. The threat is no longer terrorism. It's a problem, but not the threat. The threat is revisionist rising powers, China and Russia especially, that are teaming up as never before since the 1960s, that are challenging the liberal international order. This is the new threat. And in that context, the security strategy says straight out, our diplomats must be able to build and sustain relationships where U.S. interests are at stake. Relationships developed over time create trust and shared understanding that the United States calls upon when confronting security threats, responding to crises, and encouraging others to share the burden for tackling the world's challenges. The U.S. must upgrade our diplomatic capabilities to compete in the current environment. Wow. Talking about relationships over time, creating trust, shared understanding. So this has been music to the ears of the State Department to have this. And by the way, in May, I heard in Washington from many different people using the same term. Washington is freaked out by China. Literally freaked out. And it's not just the economic rise, it's not just the alternative form of governance, it's tech. There's an arms race underway. The Chinese are developing carrier-killing ballistic missiles, hypergliding warheads, quantum satellite communication, which we're way behind in, stealth-penetrating radars. They're already being able to penetrate our stealth technology, et cetera, et cetera. So the State Department, here's Barbara Stevenson at the plaque of fallen diplomats every year. There's a ceremony there for the latest Chris Stevens a few years ago, et cetera. There's a new justification now for why diplomacy is needed. It used to be we were the front line of defense of the United States. Not anymore. Now it's the China challenge. By the way, almost everything in Washington right now is being framed in terms of the China challenge. When I went to regional bureaus for their presentations at State, it was all about China, whether it was in Europe, Latin America, China, 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 China. I think our enemy deprivation syndrome is about to be solved. So the State Department is saying, look, China is outspending us on diplomacy. They've increased their budget since 2010 by nearly 50% for diplomacy, whereas we've reduced ours by nearly 40%. In Africa, this is the official line now from the Foreign Service Association. In many African countries, economic officers from China outnumber ours 5-1, if not 10-1. So basically, in what is emerging as an economic competition, we need people on the ground to compete with China. We need a team on the field. So this is now the new mantra at State. It's an economic diplomacy, and it's aimed at China. It's interesting. We had a visitor up in Duluth at UMD last spring, very prominent foreign policy advisor to the party and to Xi Jinping, Zhang Qingmin from the Institute of Strategic Studies at Beijing University. And he, while saying that China wants to continue rising and therefore does not want all kinds of disturbances with us and that they really don't, he said, even their foreign ministry, though, is having some of the same problems in spite of all the spending. Xi Jinping has created his own National Security Council. Right? Brand new National Security Council, same issues are arising. And Zhang Qingmin did a very interesting study. He took the foreign ministry spokesperson from China and tracked how many times that spokesperson said, I don't know, and referred the question to another ministry. In 2013, that happened 28 times. Last year, it happened 215 times. So he concludes that just like in the US, the career diplomacy in China is suddenly starting to shift with new players on the block, and that this may be an issue. Now, looking ahead, I mentioned the tech issue. Ever since Hillary Clinton, we put a lot more emphasis on public diplomacy and on using the new media to reach directly out to populations. Because our embassies are so closed off, we're moving now to the virtual realm. And we've created 6 regional media hubs. Our ambassadors are twittering and tweeting in their own name. People like Michael McFowell, when he was in Russia, was active on this. You can see we have 6 hubs coordinating this activity for the US government. We even have virtual embassies. We tried to set up a virtual embassy of the United States to Iran. And the idea being to communicate with the people of Iran. And of course, this was closed down immediately. But this kind of tech will be a big part of diplomacy. I might mention that for students today, internships at the State Department are still functioning. The summer internships at embassies around the world are still fantastic opportunities. But there's now a virtual internship where you stay at your high school or university, you become part of an embassy team, an embassy staff in Bogota or Tokyo or wherever. They task you with things basically involving media outreach. Young people are good at that, apparently. And so, anyway, I know that Global Minnesota is looking at this too, trying to get the word out to our high schools and colleges about this new opportunity that's arising with tech. And the other 2 other things now that people are proposing. One, that more posts be opened overseas. Pompeo is going in for 300 new slots in embassies. That's a pittance compared to what was lost, but it's a start anyway. In some cases, we have enough officers, we just don't have enough positions. The real dearth is at the very top. There's a lack of mentorship, and that's where the professional accumulated knowledge is in question. And then, so there is this emphasis now on professional studies. So, in concluding, in my view, eventually, we probably will come to see the traditional functions of diplomacy as necessary in this complex geopolitical situation, in a new terrain between splendid isolation and post-World War II dominance. A well-funded professional foreign service, which won't be expensive, may actually come to be seen as something that we need. When people like George Shultz or back in his day Kennan talked about diplomacy, they compared it to gardening. You've got to cultivate. It's slow. You've got to maintain the relationships. If a professional service doesn't do that, no one else will. That's the issue. And so I think a professional service has got to be part of the mix always. Now, Chaz Freeman, who is one of our more brilliant ex-ambassadors, he was ambassador to Saudi Arabia, a real China expert, looking at what the U.S. foreign policy has evolved to, highlights 2 things. The exorbitant privilege of printing money. The role of the dollar is really giving us moral hazard right and left, and we're using sanctions more than ever, all across the board, which depends on our role in the global economy. It's making other countries, including our allies, begin to question those structures and think about developing their own. And I include the Europeans in this, not just. So we could be paying, this is Chaz Freeman's point, a long-term heavy price for the way we're approaching things. As he says, you should not substitute sanctions and what he calls protracted deterrence. We're trying to isolate countries just the way we isolated the USSR, right? Country after country. Don't substitute that for real diplomacy. Tom Pickering, one of our also very famous diplomats, speaks of Nordic track diplomacy. We're pretty much running along on a treadmill of sanctions and pseudo-containment. It may be very hard to contain China as we go forward. So in conclusion, I'll just say, regardless of what's happening at the State Department, you've got these guys and you've got those guys. And the communication style of this administration is creating a lot of uncertainty, including among our allies. This is not good. We are relying on sanctions. We're pulling out of agreements. The Iran deal, Paris Climate Trans-Pacific Partnership, INF, you pay a price for this. For example, we're trying to get the Chinese now to negotiate a new intermediate forest treaty with Russia, 3 of them. And China's saying, no way, because America pulls out of treaties. We do not trust America to sign a treaty. They're afraid that we will renege. Talking to the enemy, you know, just a few years ago, especially in the George W. Bush administration, you weren't supposed to talk to the enemy. Trump has talked with Kim Jong-un. I mean, in his own way, he is more open to what diplomacy really is, which is talking with the enemy. So that's one thing that is a change. On Russia, there's a real dichotomy. You got the bromance, but this administration has been far harder on Russia than Obama or George W. Bush ever were. We're giving military aid to the Ukrainians. We're closing consulates and embassies. The sanctions are biting ever more. It's a real, as I say, a dichotomy that's hard to see. And state is being overruled. People in the Middle East Bureau really don't know what's going on. It's all in Jared Kushner's pocket. And I'm sure you all heard about the evening when Rex Tillerson showed up at a restaurant and was told that the Mexican foreign minister was meeting with Jared Kushner in the back room. And Tillerson did not know that the Mexican foreign minister was in town and went back and said, oh, next time you're in town, why don't you stop by? So this is obviously not the typical way that diplomacy is done, but it's what we have right now. My main point is this is building on a long history of shifting away from a professional foreign service, and it has implications for the U.S. government at large. So I'll stop there, and looking forward to joining Mary for a time.
Well, thank you. Let's see, can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you all for being here, and we're all thankful that it's not pouring rain again. And thank you, Tom, for that great interview or overview of both the history of diplomacy and the current questions that are out there. There are a lot of things that we could cover, and there are a lot of good questions already here. I told Tom I was in Washington last Thursday and Friday, and certainly the women that I know who are senior women who have decades of experience are top-level Arabic speakers, people who were negotiating with the Taliban up until a couple months ago, are feeling that it is not an accidental byproduct, that it is a deliberate choice to push out the women and people of color from the senior positions. Because those are the people who can be pushed out. When you're in a senior position, if you're not assigned, then after a certain period of time, you do need to leave. And, and that's a, it's not just a discouraging or a morale issue, but it means that people are being kept out or pushed out of the Foreign Service, not because of their qualifications, but because of who they are or what they look like. And the State Department actually spent decades overcoming a legacy in which that was institutionalized, and it's bad for our country. Hubert Humphrey himself was one of those people that talked about that, how we operate within our own government and types of discrimination actually has a deleterious impact on our role in the world. So anyway, I'm glad that you mentioned that. It's an issue that'll come up. There's one great question here to go to something that you directly talked about, Tom. The idea of the peace dividend after the Cold War generally is talked about as something that applies to military expenditures. And so the questioner asked for a little more comment on the focus on the State Department rather than the Defense Department in this regard. So if you could just spend a couple minutes on that.
Yeah, and as I say, reinventing government under the Clinton administration was pretty much across the board. It's hard today to remember what the mood was like. We'd won the Cold War, quote unquote. That same Francis Fukuyama had written The End of History. The idea that our values, our system had prevailed once and for all. And you had someone like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who, a prominent Democrat in the Senate, actually suggested on the floor of the Senate that the time had come to abolish the CIA, that the CIA had been a product of World War II, when it was the OSS, and then the Cold War, and we were in a new situation now where that wouldn't be necessary. So, I think it was not just the military, but also government more broadly. And I return to the point that in a sense, some of what's happened since the 1990s has been fairly bipartisan. Both the approach to government and the approach to our economy. A lot of the key deregulation of our economy that as proposed by Reagan and other Republicans was done under the Clinton administration. So, as I say, I think the evolution in the past couple of decades has been a bipartisan one. And so, I think that people underestimated in the 90s what could come and how quickly it could come. In terms of the 9/11 especially. And so we've been playing catch up ever since. And the question now is, how do we, in a time where our debt is increasing exponentially, they're about to raise the debt ceiling again, where does the money come from to shore up our diplomacy, especially when the defense budget now is up to $733 billion for this year, which is a massive increase, and with more coming. So, I'm concerned about the functioning of our governmental institutions in this situation.
The other thing that is important, just to wrap up this question, is that there was also a really dramatic drop in the number of U.S. military personnel and in the defense budget, as well as the number of nuclear warheads and all that kind of thing. So, but what doesn't usually get discussed is that thinking was not just in the military, but also that with the Cold War over, we weren't going to need such a robust diplomatic presence as we had during the Cold War. And there's another question here that goes to something, Tom, that you mentioned, and I might talk a little bit about this, that you mentioned there are 30 agencies that have offices overseas, and the questioner wondered, don't all of them report to the ambassador? And so I'd like to just, maybe give an example. My last post, I was at the U.S. mission to the European Union, and in that mission alone, we had 27 different U.S. agencies. And all of them did report to the ambassador, and the ambassador in any post can basically have someone removed if they feel like that person is not respecting the authority. But the reality is that they all have basically two bosses, because they do report back to their home agency. So the person who represents the Department of Commerce or the Department of Agriculture plays a really important independent role, but very often those departments back in Washington may be having jostling over things that happen. And for example, when I was in Poland and the Polish government new Polish government announced that it was going to pull out of Iraq, and the State Department really was leading the way, saying we need to respect that because they're still in Afghanistan. And we discovered that someone in one of our military representations was going around the ambassador and reporting back to the Department of Defense on a strategy for convincing Poland to stay, and that person was back in Washington very soon, because that kind of, that kind of authority is really important. But the reality is that even with that authority, then when those agencies are represented overseas, they're part of the Washington game as well. And so that is something that is not new with this administration at all. It's something that, like other trends, grew incrementally over the decades. But Tom, I don't know if you've had any, if you've been paying attention to this new commission that Pompeo has announced on inalienable rights,
Yep.
And whether you might want to comment on that.
Yeah. Yes, it's a pretty indicative shift. The Trump administration has been criticized for downplaying human rights. During the Obama years, there were quite a few special envoy positions added on to the State Department, fairly senior positions covering a lot of social and even gender issues as human rights issues. In a broad definition, rightfully so, of human rights. And there was some criticism of this even within the State Department, because there was a certain amount of overlapping between these new special envoys and the regular bureaus of the State Department. So when the Trump administration came in and pretty much did away with most of the special envoy positions, the American Academy of Diplomacy was not 100% opposed. They saw some logic in this, probably that it had gone too far. But it really was a part of making human rights a lower priority. So what we have now is a redefinition of human rights. Pompeo was saying that the plethora of new kinds of human rights, that plethora is watering down our commitment to the central human rights of our Constitution. And therefore, we have got to stop spending so much time on those, what he considers secondary human rights, and focus on the main ones. Right to vote, free speech, these things, as opposed to, say, gender or sexual orientation, that sort of thing. And of course, he's being criticized for that. Sticking behind all this, I think, is a tilt toward natural law, if you will. I think that this administration, especially Pence and Pompeo, both of whom are evangelical Christians of a rapture variety, and who I think see natural law as kind of a God-given thing, and it's not for mortal humans to add to the agenda, sort of. So it is a narrowing of the human rights focus and a conservative tilt in the way human rights is defined. And so, like so many things, we'll see if this outlasts the administration. One of the causes of uncertainty as countries watch us is that it's not just Trump going back and forth in his own mind, it's administration to administration, adding, undoing, sort of back and forth, and all this could well be undone by a future administration. What do you think, Mary, about that idea?
Yes, the commission.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I think one of the problems with what happens, I think every administration has a political agenda. That's how you get elected, and that's what your goal is. You have a political agenda, and there's a certain ebb and flow. And I think what has happened, though, with this administration is that there is a high level of mistrust between the political level and the professional level, who are committed to supporting the political level, and also between the leadership and our allies and others. And so no one knows for sure what the purpose of this Commission on Inalienable Rights is. And so it gets out of the gate right away, being mistrusted and with people looking for what's really behind this. And it becomes clear, though, with the names of the people appointed to it, who have a very clear ideological bent that does say that argues that the language of rights is a very narrow one, and it does refer back to their concept of God-given rights. Whereas if you read, for example, the UN Declaration on Human Rights, which was promulgated and adopted by all members of the UN in 1948, it is a very expansive look at rights, and it talks about both political rights and things like the right to education, right to housing, things like that. And so the idea that this is something that evolved in the last administration doesn't really capture the way that the discussion of rights has evolved all the way since 1948. And I think that's where that is. So we, I know, are just about out of time, but I did want to see if maybe Tom and I can conclude with a look at, there's at least 3 of you out there, apparently, who are thinking about joining the Foreign Service because of the questions that I have here. And if there's 3, there might be more, or maybe you know someone. So this is a question that I get from my students, and Tom probably gets from his students. And I, even before this sort of uncertain and turbulent time, one thing that I think is really important is both sides of the coin. The Foreign Service is service, and it's service to the country, and the idea is that you serve in a nonpartisan role, that you serve the administration that is there, and that you have to accept that that is what you are going to do. And so in any time that someone does it, they need to think about that. I certainly had some pretty strong political views in the mid-1980s, in the middle of the Reagan administration, when I joined the Foreign Service, and I thought long and hard about how that was going to work and how I was going to do that. And I've decided that there was a value in that, a value in me learning how to work that through, and a value in our government having people who had views but learned how to work for their country despite that. But everyone has to make that own decision for themselves. And so, you know, I'll wrap up, and Tom probably would too, to say that I'm happy to talk to anyone, either now or later, about that. But Tom, why don't you finish up with your thoughts on that issue?
Well, you know, the State Department, the Foreign Service is still composed of a political track, economic track, administrative, consular, public diplomacy. And that's what the Foreign Service exam is geared toward. And it's given, I think, 3 times a year. It's an online exam now, written and then oral. There's a lot of other infrastructure at state, though. The civil service can be applied to, many specialist positions. It's a wide range of positions at the State Department, if anyone's interested. With the very low numbers coming in, it became, for a while anyway, difficult for a regular undergrad or even graduate school person coming out of education to come into the Foreign Service. One of the results of Afghanistan and Iraq has been the idea of preference. Anybody who was served gets preference points for coming into to any government job now. So a lot of the positions at state were being taken by people who had been in the military. The last person at UMD who went in was wounded at Benghazi. A very good student, but who also had that happening. And of course, there are a number of fellowships like the Pickering Fellowship, which also eat up a number of the slots. So it's been very frustrating for students in the last few years, regular undergrads. But that may be changing now with larger numbers coming in. The whole Afghanistan-Iraq thing is fading in the background again. So I think it's going to become an easier time. We're going to really need young people who know languages. I really believe that that kind of understanding is going to become more and more important going forward. I think we've gone way far in one direction, we're going to come back the other. One factor that I see referred to more and more often is the idea of empathy, that you've got to understand and empathize with the other side, not agree with it, but understand where it's coming from in order to steer its behavior toward goals that you're pursuing. That's a part of diplomacy. And that's going to require people, I think we need to get back to area studies in our universities. When the Soviet Union sent up Sputnik in 1957, we responded with massive investment in education. The National Defense Education Act, foreign languages, all sorts of things. Right now, we're responding with massive military spending and a certain number of walls going up. So I'm hoping this is a pendulum swing and that it's going to be really a halcyon period for young Americans coming into the Foreign Service before too long. On that note of optimism, Mary, thank you. Yeah, great. Thanks, everybody.